that one.
No, no, it's better that one off, I'd say, yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
good, that's brilliant. Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's one of the smallest crowds we've had for a number of years because the weather isn't great and things like that. Richard was with the County Library, I think. He's now with Mayfield Library, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
So he's going to give us a talk on Dean at Blarney, and anything about Blarney that he knows, I suppose. So I'll hand you over to Richard and we'll carry on. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me this evening. And I'm with the Blarney Historical Society. The Blarney Historical Society. I don't know if anybody has ever been out there. We'd have a lecture once a month like yourselves. I prepared this one for the Blarney Historical Society. So it is local in that sense, and it went into our journal as well. I presented it at Blarney in January, last January. So it's kind of a local talk, sure enough. But before we start, has everybody been to Blarney? Has anybody never been to Blarney? Yeah, maybe hands up, maybe it makes more sense. Nobody never been to Blarney, no? So everybody here in the room has been there. And then you have, of course, the Woolen Mills is the big operation, and you have the Muskerry Arms, and you have the Blarney Castle Hotel. It's called the Blarney Castle Hotel, but just above the middle windows. Have people been into it? Has anybody? Yeah, there's several heads nodding anyway. I wouldn't imagine everybody has been into it, but it might enhance the talk if you have been in it. Yeah, it might enhance the talk a little.
And enjoy the food and the service.
Well, basically, I grew up there. I grew up there, and it's still in the family. I'm kind of out of it, but it's still in the family. They managed to get rid of me and up the standards. So I suppose having grown up there, I looked into the history of it on and off over the years and just put it together then for the local history society. But it's I suppose, as you know, with family history, you know, people. Family history is all about people, and then people make places, as they say. So people and places are inseparable. Whether you're talking about a townland or a village, but also even about an address, a premises, a business premises. So it's not entirely unrelated to genealogy. You know, you hopefully you'll see as we go along. Okay, so we're talking about the inn at Blarney. This has had many different names over the years. The earliest name back in the 18th century was Geoffrey's Arms. Then I found references to the Blarney Inn. It became known as Smith's Hotel for a large part of its existence. And very briefly, the Blarney, Cork and Muskerry Railway Hotel. I think the explanation is nearly in the name as to why that was brief. It was a bit long. And then the Blarney Castle Hotel, which is the name that it still has today, the Blarney Castle Hotel. So we're tracing the history of that business, and we're tracing it really through the families that were associated with it. And the families, well, first of all, I have a mention way back in the 1600s, which I'll get onto next. But the families, really, the family names, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 of them anyway. 4 of them are Prosser, Smith, Cagney and Forrest, which would be my own name and the current name on the business. So they're the families associated with it. But who's this unnamed woman from the 1600s? Well, the earliest reference I came across to what you could call an inn or a hostelry or a public house, I suppose, in Blarney is from the 1640s. It's from 1642, and there's the original. And basically, there was a man in the Blarney Castle. He was corporal of the guard one night. His name was Philip Ring, and it was one of his duties to have the guard in place at the castle. And he couldn't find the soldiers who were supposed to be on duty when he went looking for them, until eventually he found Donald Long and others in a house drinking. He called Long out to come to his guard, only for Long to earnestly desire Ring to come in to drink with him. Ring declined, but would not away without him, and after much ado, he got Long out and set him upon his post. Philip Ring then returned to the house and asked the woman there, why did she let Long have drink when she knew he had no money? So that's a very, very early reference really to what you might call a hostelry or an inn. and it's actually associated with the rebellion of that time. It emerged in the witness statements, but we need have no concern with that at the moment. So that's the earliest reference, and that's long before the planned village of Blarney was built. Blarney is a planned village. They're scattered around Ireland, and they emerged mostly in the next century, the 1700s. And they were generally the work of a landlord family. And in Blarney's case, that was the Jeffreys family. They came into the ownership of the Blarney Castle towards the end of the 1600s. And it was James St. John Jeffreys, 1734 to 1780, who was largely credited with the formation of Blarney village. And those illustrations were unknown to us out in Blarney. I have to say I just came across them online really with some thorough searching, but I think they're in a copy of what's that agricultural writer's name again? Arthur Young, in a copy of Arthur Young's Tour of Ireland in the National Library. In one copy, those plans were found. So you can see the square in Blarney and how it was envisaged as a planned village. It didn't fully come to fruition. The side on the right would be the one that really did kind of complete almost fully. You can see on each side there's two buildings in the middle of each side that protrude a little. And that's still the case on the right hand side with the police station and the hotel out in Blarney. They still have that. So a planned village, and that emerged in the 1700s. 1765, thereabouts, things got off the ground. And Arthur Young, he visited it, and he has left us an invaluable description of the budding village, the budding industrial village. He visited in 1776, and he just managed to catch the Jeffreys family as they were leaving for France, off on their hulls, no doubt. And Young didn't let slip the opportunity to make some inquiries, and he has left us with a great description of the developments that were begun in 1765. A dozen mills had been built or were building, requiring many hands and skills, and this made for a booming economy. Advertisements even ran in Belfast to attract artisans to a new industrial village at the other end of the country. In addition to a small army of weavers, there were 18 bleachmen and a dozen pattern printers. There were print cutters and pencillers, tubmen, coppermen, a calendar, and tire boys. I don't know what tire boys were. There were draftsmen, a manager, a clerk, and 3 carters to carry what needed carrying around the young village and to and from Cork. So you can see it was a hive of activity, of economic activity. The square was fringed with well-built houses, providing homes for a vibrant working population. And also featuring was a market house from which, says Young, £100 worth of knitted stockings were sold each week. And Blarney was always big for socks. It was the same in the Mannies had the mills later, the production of stocks. Now, the Protestant church was completed in 1777, and what else would you expect, what else was essential in a newly laid out 18th century village? Why, a large handsome inn, of course. And that's exactly how Young described it, a large handsome inn. He says that Jeffreys, the landlord, put £250 towards it, and the tenant, or the person who would be running it, put £300 towards it, making a total of £550 to build Blarney's inn, built of excellent stone, lime and slate. Now, another of Jeffreys' developments were his improvements at the castle. He laid out ornamental grounds featuring wooded walks, stone features, and enhanced the lake, the picturesque lake. And that would in time, of course, feed into the budding and lucrative tourist trade that Blarney would become famous for. Now, in the 18th century, by the way, in this slide you can see another symptom of the economic boom. 14 boys were sent from the poorhouse in Cork out to the village of Blarney to be bound apprentices to the linen weavers there. So you really have a place that was taking off economically. Now, at this time, an inn would typically be named after the local landlord family. You can see examples that still exist would be the Lansdowne Arms in Kenmare or the Wallace Arms in Mill Street. And Blarney was no different it became known as the Jeffreys Arms. And often an inn would carry the coat of arms of that family, and that would be recognisable. As you can imagine, most people were illiterate in these times, so a written sign wouldn't mean much. So the coat of arms of the landlord family would often be the inn sign. And just as a slight aside, in the Cork Journal, the earliest surviving Cork newspaper, there's very little illustration, but in a couple of copies there are depictions of inn signs from Cork in the 1750s. So I made copies of them, and you can see the Hart and Crown in the Castle Street, South Main Street area, the Three Nuns on what was Hammond's Marsh, near the Mersey, and the Half Moon and Three Stars, which was on the North Main Street. So you can see that they'd be recognisable instantly, rather than the words being spelled out. So that was inn signs for you at that time. Now, as for the business of an inn, what was expected? Well, there's a few advertisements. There's one for Dublin in 1747, and it is advertised, a new inn advertised as being 2 stories high, with 4 rooms on each floor, out offices, and a large backside. That's what it said. There was a garden, orchard, 14 acres of grazing ground, 4 of choice meadow, and plenty turf convenient. And you see, you didn't have Musgraves, or you didn't have any cash and carry or anything like that. The table had to be supplied as locally as possible, and that was often by the inn itself, really. Now, if we go to Cahir in 1778, we have John Murphy opening a new inn, and he notified the public that he was fitting out the inn lately built by Lord Cahir, a fine roomy house with choice stabling, hay, old oats, and exceeding good beds. Mr. Murphy promised a larder, this was very important, constantly supplied with what was in season, and cellars stocked with the best wines and liqueurs. He was determined to give satisfaction to those pleased to honour him with their commands, and entreated their convenience and esteem, but only so long as the good order and regularity of his house would merit it. So once it started going downhill, he didn't expect his customers to stay at all. Now, in terms of the inn at Blarney, we also have, we don't have that quite as elaborate as that, but we do have an opening notice that appeared in the Cork Evening Post. And it tells us that John Prosser, late butler to St. John Jeffreys Esquire, will open an inn and breakfast house in the town of Blarney on the 1st of May. He has laid in a stock of the best wines. A dinner will be served every Sunday lunch, an old tradition, and during the summer, between 2 and 3, £1 British shilling a head. So that gives us really an opening date for the inn at Blarney, the topic of our discussion. Another early enough, 8 years later, an early enough reference that I found is from the Hibernian Chronicle. It is on microfilm in the County Library, 1777, and it is the old story, lost and found at the Jeffreys Arms in Blarney, a set ring. Whoever proves property and pays the expense of this advertisement shall have it by applying to Mr. Prosser. So it says a bit about the times that you had to pay the expense of the advert. You weren't getting it for free that way.
At the said what?
Say it again?
Their house. Oh yeah.
At the said house. Yeah.
How
that's
come
right.
there's a kind of an S that's sort of like an F?
That was the way
And
the
then
S
an
was.
ordinary S.
The S was written that way. That's the way. You can see his name, Mr. Prosser. The double S has that depiction of
Yeah,
it.
but there's an ordinary S then for and pays.
I think it was when
PAYS.
I think it was often when it was a double S. You know the German letter that looks a bit like
Yeah.
a B. That's actually the same. That's like the double S as well.
Okay.
But it is lost in English. No, there's a slight. I couldn't fully determine the exact location of the inn. This is a Daniel Ahers map of Blarney village from 1800. So we're talking 30 years after the foundation of the inn. And on this map, you probably can't see it quite there, but the names are depicted. This is the square in Blarney. The Blarney Castle Hotel is here. But this premises has Prosser on it, which is the name we're talking about, Prosser. And that's that house on the square. No, so that would suggest that that was the inn. And I can't say definitively that it wasn't. But it doesn't fit Arthur Young's description of a large, commodious building. It is possible that in time, when the Prossers faded, that the inn was opened up here instead, in the larger premises. I can't tell for certain. But certainly, whatever was the physical footprint, I think there's still a continuity in the business. I think that will emerge as well in the talk as we go through it.
What year is the map?
1800, Daniel Latter's map. The Blarney Castle have done lovely coloured reproductions of it in poster format around the village, outside around the village. Now I'm going to delve into literature because when I was preparing this talk I was reading Adam Bede, a novel by George Eliot. You've probably heard of George Eliot, the great 19th century novelist. And in Adam Bede she gives a fantastic pen picture of an 18th century innkeeper. And I couldn't believe the coincidences or the similarities to the topic I was preparing myself. So in Adam Bede, she tells us that Methodists are expected to preach on the village green. Of course we have a village green here. This now is in a little town somewhere in England. And there was a buzz in the summer air. The weather-beaten sign of the Donithorn Arms leaves the visitor ignorant as to the heraldic bearings of the ancient family of Donithorn. A small farmyard and a pretty take of land promised the traveller a good feed for himself and his horse. Mr. Casson, the innkeeper, is standing at the door with his hands in his pockets, looking towards the green. He consists physically of two spheres bearing the same relation to each other as the earth and the moon. That is to say, the lower sphere, at a rough guess, is 13 times larger than the upper one, which performs the function of a mere satellite. But his head is not at all a melancholy-looking satellite, nor a spotty globe, as Milton irreverently called the moon. On the contrary, no face looks more sleek and healthy, chiefly featuring a pair of round, ruddy cheeks with slight interruptions formed by the nose and eyes, scarcely worth the mention. It was one of jolly contentment, tempered by a sense of personal dignity, dignity which could hardly be considered excessive in a man who had been butler to the family for 15 years, and who now was necessarily very much in contact with his inferiors. And as we saw there, John Prosser was butler to the Jeffreys. While watching the happenings on the green, a horseman pulls up and a conversation ensues. Mr. Casson tells the horseman that he is not native to these parts himself. You may tell by my tongue, sir. There are curious talkers in this country. The gentry has hard work to understand them. I was brought up among the gentry, sir, and got the turn of their tongue when I was a boy. Why, what do you think the folks here says for heaven to you? The gentry, you know, says heaven to you, while the people about here says hania. It's what they call the dialect spoke here about, sir. That's what I've heard Squire Donithorn say many a time, it's the dialect. So there was a range of coincidences there, I thought. But going back to our own man, John Prosser, he may well have been Welsh, or at least of Welsh extraction, because the surname comes from Ap Roger, meaning son of Roger. And while George Eliot's innkeeper is fictional, there's a much more dramatic true story about our John from the year 1785. 1785, that was the year that Timothy Donovan's body was found at Willison's Weir near Blarney, with a stone tied around his neck. It's a rather gruesome story, and hay stuffed in his mouth. Donovan was a native of Carrigadruchid, and he was a well-known pedlar who travelled about staying in different houses, and they often had quite a bit of money on them, pedlars. He frequently stayed with John Looney, who was sometimes his assistant, and when Looney sold one of Donovan's horses, he was suspected of the murder. Looney was pursued vigorously in the country between Carriganimma and Mill Street by Prosser, innholder at Blarney. And he finally apprehended him. Looney admitted he committed the deed with a spade and attempted to throw Donovan's body into a deep hole in the river, but missed. He was hanged and quartered at the place where the crime was committed, and his head struck off and placed on a spike over the county jail at the Southgate Bridge. So it was Prosser led the party that apprehended him. And the scene of that crime would have been on the road between Blarney and Tower. The river flows along there. Now, we move on from from John to his son Thomas. And he was another intrepid individual, Thomas Prosser. He was born in 1774, and he trained as a linen and cotton printer that tied in with the mills in operation in the village. But the magnet of republicanism sweeping Ireland at that time proved too strong. It pulled him away. And he joined the non-sectarian cause led by men such as Wolfe Tone, who wanted a united Ireland of all creeds and classes free of English domination. So he became a United Irishman, you could say. Now, Thomas proved to be no passive supporter of this at all. In fact, he immersed himself in it to the extent that he was arrested in the fateful year itself, 1798. And there we have a little account of it. Yesterday was found guilty by court-martial Thomas Prosser, son to an innkeeper in Blarney. His crime was disaffection to the government and swearing several persons to be true to the French and to assist them at their landing. Now, he was incarcerated at the Northgate Bridge. As you know, there was a prison at both bridges. And after several months, he was brought on board the Minerva in February 1799. And the Minerva was Australia-bound, a new penal colony, and there was many other United Irishmen among his 200 convicts. Now, the ship's surgeon was a young man. He was John Washington Price, and he kept a lively journal which was published in 2000 in Australia. So we learn a bit more about Thomas Prosser and the escapades of the innkeeper's son. Lying off Sydney, he was involved in an escape attempt with Florence McCarthy and Edward O'Hara. McCarthy, 22, a lawyer from Cork, was found stowed away on an American whaling ship before it sailed, and he was sentenced to a flogging. He wasn't sorry that was cancelled, and he was put to hard labour instead. O'Hara was 31 and a tallow chandler from Belfast. And Prosser and he were both set to punishing work as salt boilers on Norfolk Island. Gruesome work, salt boiling. In 1807, Thomas led another escape attempt on board the Harrington, which was bound for Madras in India. And for that he was sent to Van Diemen's Land by no less than William Bligh himself, who was now governor of New South Wales, previously of HMS Bounty. And the story of the mutiny on that ship, of course, has been told many, many times. And Bligh himself played by Marlon Brando and by Anthony Hopkins in film versions. So he sent Thomas Prosser off to Van Diemen's Land. Now, one source says that Thomas died in Batavia, which is now Indonesia, while he was making his way home to Ireland in 1817. Possibly his sentence had finished. But another tells us that he married in Port Dalrymple, now that's Launcesstown in Tasmania, in 1819. Either way, a long way from home and the inn at Blarney. Now, we'll move into the 1800s, and something that hit Ireland very hard was the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. There was a massive economic slump that really shocked the country. Prices sunk, mill proprietors went bankrupt or close to it, and they couldn't get their concerns off their hands quick enough. And of course, that naturally had an impact on the business of the inn. And it is possible that the inn ceased to exist for a time, or maybe it just chugged along at a very reduced rate, but we don't really learn much about it for a couple of decades. And we do learn that in Blarney generally, by 1824, the pleasure grounds laid out by Jeffreys were described as neglected. The neat and trim walks were overrun with brambles and wild flowers, and the village was described as little better than a massive ruin wearing rags of finery and weeds of woe. Huge economic downturn. That was a bridge that the Jeffreys built as part of their improvements at their economic village, and they were going to divert the river to flow under this new bridge. But they never got that far. They built the beautiful bridge but never diverted the river. So Blarney at this time was known as a place, as a village that was a village that had a river with no bridge and a bridge with no river. And the dry bridge was eventually, you can see Blarney Castle through the middle arch, It was eventually filled in. It is an ordinary roadway now. If you were going along what was the top of it, you wouldn't ever know there was a bridge there at all. So, massive decline. The trees in the square were cut down, and the trim little houses around it were roofless, and it was said to be yellow in corn grown in it. So the process passed on. I can't find any record of exactly what happened to them, but apart from Thomas in Australia, but they passed on. And the next family we know to be associated with the inn at Blarney are the Smiths. Now, there's a lease record for the mill from 1794, before this economic slump, and that details a Thomas Smith and an Edward O'Donoghue in partnership. Now, this Thomas Smith had Limerick connections, and he was made a freeman of Limerick in 1794. And earlier in 1750, that's the indenture with Jeffreys there top left, O'Donoghue and Thomas Smith. And as I say, this Thomas Smith had definite Limerick connections. He was a freeman of Limerick, and so was his brother. That's the two there, Thomas and John. But much earlier in 1750, there was a Furlong Smith who was a freeman of Limerick, and he is from Newcastle West. And Thomas's son was also called Furlong. So I think there could be a family connection between all of them, really. I can't say for certain, but certainly Thomas's son was also called Furlong. An unusual first name. Now, this second Furlong, he was a native Blarney man, and he was farming in the townland of Clogheen-Milcon in 1825, and he was also an agent for the landlord Jeffreys. And we know this because one night one of his farm servants woke up and spied fire through a crevice in the wall. A strong breeze saved the farmhouse, but all the corn, all the hay, all the farm buildings were all destroyed at the Smith's farm. 1825. Now, Furlong was likely Protestant, but his wife Margaret Cronin was from one of the strong Catholic farming families in the parish. And it was thought that the fire was malicious, and a notice of reward went out in the press shortly afterwards, and there are 6 Cronins among the 43 contributors to that. So they would have been Margaret Cronin's family, relatives, Furlong's father-in-law and other relatives, the Cronins. Now, Furlong and Margaret had a family, and I was able to trace several of them. And the ones that we will be following as the talk goes on are George, Mary and Anne. The last 3 there. We'll be concentrating on them. And here we can see George's baptism record in the Blarney Parish Records on the 5th of April. And in the same volume is a lovely little depiction of a fish by Father Batchu Horgan, the well-known Blarney priest who built 2 schools and 2 round towers in the parish. Now, whether it's the fish as the Christian symbol, or whether he was just dreaming of going fishing, I don't know. But anyway, that's George's baptism record there. Now, 1837 has been sometimes given as the foundation date of the hotel. And you can see that it was used in advertising over the years by my parents to some extent. There's a pen and matchboxes there. Now, it could well be the year that Furlong and Margaret took a lease on the business, that they took their lease. And if it did move further up the street to that premises, maybe that's when that happened. That's just conjecture. But there's no question that around that time they were operating the business with a young family. In 1845, business was in full swing, and when St. John Jeffreys, the landlord, laid on a harvest home dinner for all social classes, Furlong was one of the main purveyors of the bill of fare. He did the catering. This was an elaborate affair. There was 2 tables that were close to 200 feet in length, and another cross-lying table for the higher social classes. They had a view of the lake, Blarney Lake. So it was a big occasion, and the menu that Furlong Smith helped to provide consisted of 4 monster rounds of beef, 20 hams, 300 weight of pork, 300 loaves of bread, an immense quantity of potatoes and other vegetables. So they were being treated to a feast really. And Furlong is stated to be of the Blarney Inn. So that's another name now that we got, the Blarney Inn. You can see it just here. 1845, often given as the first year of the famine, isn't it? And that's what the people were feasting on before the hard times really hit. So even though the Spit family are running the business, they're not, it's not known as Spit's Hotel at this point. Now 300 weight of pork, by the way, in case you're wondering, is the same as 336 pounds of it, or 24 stone, or 152 kilos. Just to give you the other measurements. Now Furlong himself died on May the 21st, 1851, and I would surmise that he was in his 50s. And of course the famous genealogical source, Griffith's Valuation, that was done for Cork to a large extent the following year in 1852, and sure enough that gives us Margaret Spit in its listing. It gives us Margaret Spit for the hotel, but also for the square in Blarney as well. She had the lease on the square, which is given as 2 acres, 1 rood and 6 perches. And the square stayed in the family's lease till 1879. And in that year it reverted to the castle, and the castle gave 17 acres of land in place of it. 17 acres to the family. And what I now see as possibly a curious hangover in relation to the square is when my father would send me out when I was aged about 12 or 13, he would send me out across the street to trim a bit of hedging that faced the hotel. And I did it in the summertime, no problem at all, but it looks like we could have dispensed doing that in 1879 when it went out of the Spit family lease. That's just conjecture really. Now, growing up in the 1980s, etc., many of the old stone outbuildings of the hotel were largely unmodified. And it was easy to picture cattle, horses, hens and straw occupying them. In many ways like a farmyard, you know, that was the times that were in it in the 1700s and the 1800s. And when an external stone staircase was being removed around 2004, there was an old bucket found in it, an old iron bucket with mortar clinging to the sides, and you could see the horsehair in the mortar. So that was used in some kind of reconstruction at one time, and it was probably full of holes, no more good, and they threw it into the staircase as they were building it. That was an external staircase up to a loft. Now Margaret herself, she lived on to the ripe old age of 80, passing away in 1880. And her children would have been in their 40s and 50s at that point. They'd have been well grown up. So the 3 children that we're interested in now are George, Mary and Anne. And none of them ever married. They remained single all their lives. And they also had a farm. They had a farm about 2 or 3 miles away in Claroe. Not too far from Blair's Inn, which you might know, and not too far from Claroe Church. Well, in between the two of them, if you like. The family also held that farm. And I think brother John, one of the older children, he was out there. Now, and Mary also lived out there with brother John, while George and Anne stayed in the hotel. They remained in the hotel continuously. Now, as the 19th century wore on, Blarney revived massively as a mill town, and that was thanks to the Manny woolen factory. There was 150 employed in 1845. It's said that the Blarney area didn't suffer any debt in the famine, you know, and it isn't surprising when they were eating so much pork, I suppose, and so much beef maybe. But in that same year, 1845, there was 150 people had employment in Manny's woolen mills, and that rose to 700 in the 1880s. So you can see there was a massive local business base for the hotel as well. The Mannies built terraces of housing, and the workers were on reliable wages. And men with specialist skills relating to machines and manufacturing processes they often came over from England and Scotland, and they'd live in the village or stay in the hotel for temporary accommodation. So it was economically booming again. But disaster struck in 1869, as it always will, when fire destroyed much of the mills, a catastrophic fire. And it could have finished off a less resilient family than the Mannies, but they set to work, and Phoenix-like, the business rose from the ashes stronger than ever after 1869. And among those that the Mannies acknowledged for their help on the disastrous night were the Smith brother and sister. You can see their names highlighted there, Mr. and Miss Smith. So good times did come again, and George was stocking fine cigars from the London, Birmingham and Havana Cigar Company in 1876, as well as several other places around Cork City. The year 1886 was a momentous year in the history of the hotel. It was now very much Smith's hotel. And this is how it looked in 1886. The police station is beside it. You can see the RIC men sitting on the windowsill. There's somebody looking out the middle upper window, just above the sign of the hotel. That's how it looked in 1886. And that was the year a new lease was agreed with the Colthursts. The Jeffreys now were gone. The Colthurst family had intermarried with them, and the Colthursts were the new landlord family. And a new lease was arranged with the Smiths for the hotel. It was a 100-year lease. So George got to work, and he spent £1,100 developing the new premises, expanding the whole thing. And this is how it looked post redevelopment. A lot of similarities. You can still see the sign over the middle door, but the 3-storey part on the right has been added. That didn't exist at that point. And that's just an advert then for tenders for the builders. And the builder who undertook the work was Barry McMullen, a very prominent firm of Cork builders at the time, McMullen's. And their best known work is probably St. Peter and Paul's Church on near Patrick Street. The cornerstone for that was laid in 1859, and the 3 names figuring on it are Edward Pugin, the architect, Barry McMullen himself, the builder, and of course Father John Murphy, the instigator of the project, or Black Eagle.
Church of Ireland or what? McMullen, was he Church of Ireland? Or?
That I don't know. But they were very prominent Cork builders. I think one of his sons became the city architect as well. And Father John Murphy went by the name Black Eagle because he had lived with the Indians in America for a time as well. So now the hotel had acquired its imposing 3-storey frontage at this time. And an attractive set of iron railings were added at the front. This was a personal touch with the inclusion of the decorative initials GS, standing for George Smith. Now, they were always painted uniformly, one colour for the whole set of railings, and people wouldn't have known that the initials were in the set unless it was pointed out to them. And goodness knows we did that many times growing up, to relatives or tourists or whoever. But when they're painted in a different colour, of course, they do stand out more. Now, it's possible that their inclusion was suggested to George rather than any symptom of vanity. They may well have been suggested to him. And what makes me think that is that a similar, slightly earlier set exists at Sydney Place, near Skullvilla, and they bear the year 1881. So it is like the maker, I haven't found out the maker yet, that the maker put that kind of motif in that part of the railings, and maybe rather than being in any way vain, it was just suggested to him. But coincidentally, both sets are painted exactly the same at the moment. Those in Blarney are black with gold for the lettering, and those at Sydney Place are black with gold for the numbers. So that's just a pure coincidence. And here you have some contemporary detail for the redevelopment in 1886, 1887, and it includes the interesting expense, you probably can't read it there, but I have it rewritten down at the bottom, of £8 10 shilling for installing an internal bell system. And these bells, they still hang in the hallway of the hotel, though they no longer function. The old-fashioned kind of service bells. And here we have a price list for the remodelled hotel. God be with the days when you could get a drink so cheaply. So G. Smith, you see he's given the place a new name that didn't last very long, the Blarney, Cork and Muskerry Railway Hotel, because that was a new development as well, the Muskerry tram. G. Smith, proprietor, extended and improved, and it'll be found most comfortable. And you could get brandy for 7p, port, sherry for 4p, whiskey was as expensive as 5p or 3.5p, rum and gin were both at 4p. You could get Bass's ale for 3p, Guinness Double X Stout for 2.5p, Guinness Single for 2p, and then you had ginger ale, lemonade, ginger beer and soda water, and they were 2p or 3p. Tenora hadn't come along yet, although I have seen an advert for Tenora from about 1917 or something like that, so it's around quite a while. And you have some bottles bearing the legend Smith's Hotel on them, and then rooms for tourists and parties, etc. So a new business to some extent, a new revamped business. Now at this time,
It says Smith's Bottles. Was he brewing as well?
well, most places would have bottled their own beer. They wouldn't have brewed it, but they would have bottled it themselves. That would have been done up to maybe 1950s, you know, even.
Okay, they would have gone in a big barrel, is it, and then just...
I suppose that's what they would have done. And they would have had their own labels, you know, later as well. You know, maybe a Guinness label with the name of the pub or the hotel on it. You'd see them sometimes still around.
Were they found by accident or by excavation?
They were found by a local man by accident. They found in the woods in perfect condition, actually. And they were a real...
And where are they now?
I have one in the bag. I can show it to you there later if you like. But at this time, 1887, George was now 58. And he and his sisters, of course, were very much respected members of the community. And when the new church was being built in the village, that's the present-day Catholic Church, they contributed financially. And the altar of the Sacred Heart in the Blarney Catholic Church is dedicated to George's memory. He contributed a substantial donation of £100 for seating the church in 1896. And the altar of the Sacred Heart on the left-hand side, when you're facing the altar, is dedicated to him, I suppose. Or at least his contribution helped dedicated to his memory. Now, on the other hand, whatever about respectability, George was up before the law on several occasions, because you'd have crowds out from the city, crowds out from Cork, and they'd be feasting on crew beans and porter in Smith's tap room. They all know what crew beans were. And they had the potential to get rowdy. I can remember growing up that we'd call the young fellas coming out from Cork, we'd call them Corkies. And you know, sometimes we were a bit suspicious of them. But anyway, there'd be people out from the city, especially on holidays, especially like the Wit Weekend. The Wit Weekend was always a flashpoint for trouble. And George and Annie, no doubt, would have had to develop strong diplomatic skills. And an incident-filled August evening in 1888 captures the energy of the times. The industrial village, the conviviality of the pub, the role of alcohol, and political disharmony. Now, on this occasion in August 1888, George was prosecuted for a disorderly house, dismissed. 2 customers were charged with assault, guilty, and others were charged with riotous behaviour, dismissed. Now, the story is that Constable Shea was sitting outside the barracks at 9 o'clock, and he heard roaring and singing coming from Smith's. A man named Buckley came out, hooted and shouted, "Balfour!" Anybody remember who Balfour was? Balfour was the Irish Chief Secretary at the time in the government. And this happened a number of times. Buckley went back in and then he reappeared and he hooted that at the constable again. So he was trying to provoke the constable, I suppose, really, you could say. Constable Shea could hear clapping of hands, the noise of bottles knocking off tables and things like that, and he concluded that there was a regular scene of rowdyism in the house. Eventually, at 10 to 10, Sergeant McCradden and the constables entered. The sergeant saw Mr. Smith behind the bar and drew his attention to the disorderly conduct and told him it couldn't be allowed to go on. Mr. Smith said he couldn't help it. The sergeant attempted to take names and had 3 taken when Miss Smith, that's Annie, Miss Smith came to the door and called him. And as he turned, he was struck twice on the poll and was covered in blood. The poll, I think, is the back of the head, is that right? Back of the hole. He sent his constables back to the barracks to get their arms and to arrest anyone who tried to get out. This was serious stuff. Now, the defence suggested that Sergeant McCradden was in an excited state and had earlier entered the premises at 8:15 when there was singing. Who was singing then, the defence asked. A Scotchman was singing as I was coming out, and there were 3 or 4 others joining in. Was it a Scotch song? I believe it was. Have you any doubt about it? I didn't understand a word of it, is what he said in court. The defence argued that the later shouting and noise were simply the applauding of the singing and not a feature of riotous or disorderly crowd, and there was no illegal disorder before the police entered. It contended that Sergeant McCradden improperly went into the public house, that Mr. Smith only had to account for himself up to 10 to 10 when the police entered, and that nothing illegal had taken place prior to that. So that's basically why most of the charges were dismissed, but the 2 guys were found guilty of assault. Overriding the need for convictions, the magistrates were concerned with the peace in the district and that they dismissed the charges. There was 3 magistrates. Lieutenant Colonel Caddell commented, I think there is a great deal too much talk about this. Mr. Townsend said, it is better not to go into any of the righteous behaviour cases at all. And Mr. Young, the other magistrate, said that there would be no more cases like these, there should be no more cases like these bringing the police and the people into collision. So they wanted to kind of diffuse it, if you like. Now, a small little incident that came down by word of mouth to myself concerns a customer who for some reason should not have been on the premises. He shouldn't have been served. Perhaps it was a Sunday, when the licensing laws specified that only a person travelling could order a drink in a public house. People were always trying to find a way around that one. In any case, this customer said to another one, old George Smith doesn't know that I am here at all. Unfortunately, he hadn't realised old George was sitting right behind him and promptly put him off the premises. Now, there's the Muskerry Light Railway coming around near Ballincollig, and in the late 19th century, tourism really was beginning to boom. People were moving more, people from abroad as well were coming to visit Ireland in more numbers. And even in 1893, there was a well-publicised attempt to bring the Blarney stone to Chicago for the World's Fair. That was prevented, and a replica of the castle had to suffice. But here you see a newspaper from 1917, the Freeman's Journal, with what you could call holiday-making notices. You can see Tremor there, and Holt, and Kilkee is up there, and Smith's Hotel Blarney. So they were getting in on the new trends, if you like. But of course, local business was very important, and we have a favourite with these little notices. 1894, the Cork Cycle Club set out for Blarney on their opening run of the season, and the tandem attracted a lot of interest. And then tea was partaken of at Smith's. 1904, not actually Smith's, but I couldn't resist putting it in. Mr. Andrews of 10 Patrick Street, for genuine artificial teeth, visited Blarney fortnightly. He went to Ryan's restaurant. 1914, the Christian Brothers past pupils visited the castle and Smith's, where they were supplied in an excellent manner and enjoyed singing, with much more decorum maybe than the one I just described. And they were back in Cork at 10 p.m. In 1921, the person who took a dark frieze overcoat by mistake from Smith's Hotel last sports day returned the same. 1921, the sub-office of the National Bank was opening at Smith's on October the 13th and thereafter on fair days. And finally, again something taken inadvertently, or maybe not, 1922, taken outside the hotel, A new Lugania Gents bicycle, substantial reward for information leading to recovery. That gives us a flavour of the times. As does the AGM of the Musgrave Terrier Coursing Club. Terrier coursing, I didn't know anything about it, but factory workers often couldn't afford greyhounds to keep them, train them, etc. So they'd go for whippets. And they would cross the whippets with a bit of terrier blood to get a bit of gameness into them. And that was like the poor man's coursing, if you like. And there was the AGM of the Musgrave Terrier Coursing Club. And Heinrich Hallerberg was present at that. He was 34, and he was from Bavaria. He was a chef at St. Anne's Hydropathic Establishment, a very top-notch place on the Blarney Tower Road, and he donated a cup to the club. That's just a little bit about it there. So, locally, very active, of course, the hotel, but also visitors coming in as well. Now, it's only balanced to acknowledge the stresses and strains accompanying any way of life, and in 1893, we see that George was anxious to retire from business. He was 64 at that point, and he was offering a lease to be agreed on. The business was described as highly remunerative and established for over 200 years. Now, that seems like an exaggeration, but it does support the idea of continuity from the Jeffreys Arms. And then there's a description of the hotel at that time. That didn't work because 8 years later, the 1901 census shows that George was still operating as a hotelier. That's why he gave him the occupation column, and he was now age 70. But 2 years later, he would finally check in to the great hotel in the sky. And his sister Annie followed in 1912, after almost 10 years at the helm. She died suddenly of a heart attack, and her death certificate records her as hotel proprietor. Mary then followed 5 years after that, in 1917. She died at the farm in Clareau, where she seems to have lived mostly, but her death record does record her as being a vintner, which equates with a publican. The three of them left hefty wills. God, it's terrible to be dead, isn't it? People nosing into your life in every aspect. You have George in 1903 with 8,500. It's a big sum of money at that time. Annie then in 1912, 5,300, and Mary in 1917, back up to 6,200. And when they were old, when they were elderly, which they were, they had a manager managing the premises. And one of the most popular ones of those was a John Coleman. He was a relative, actually, this John Coleman. And politics was very fractious at that time, and John Coleman claimed a lodger vote in one election, and he had to prove that he was entitled to vote, and he said that he had a room at the hotel which was unfurnished. It was 5 shillings a week, and he was allowed to vote as under those terms. That was when the O'Brienites, etc., and all those were the Redmondites, when they were all kind of at war with each other in political terms. Now, the Spits are buried in Garrycline, which is the Blarney graveyard. There's a new one and an old one. They're buried in the old one. And they have one of the most impressive monuments in the graveyard, really. And there's plenty, the whole family seems to be buried there. The parents as well are mentioned. Now, this manager, John Coleman, he died suddenly at the hotel as well. He died of a heart attack also. He was aged 54, and he was lamented as having been very popular. Now, the Spits also had plenty Cronin relatives. You remember I said their mother was Margaret Cronin? Now we're coming up to 9 o'clock, but will we continue for a while, is it?
Oh, yeah.
So now they had lots of Cronin relatives. And one of them, a Mary Cronin, had married a Daniel Cagney. This Daniel Cagney was a physician, a doctor in Charleville, and they married in 1877. Mary Cronin and Daniel Cagney. Now, she was widowed early-ish, and that was in 1893. And when she was widowed, she returned to Blarney to a farm in Blarney. And one of her children was Michael Cagney. And this Michael Cagney went on to become a doctor like his father. And in 1901, Michael Cagney was staying at Claroe with Mary Smith. He was aged 21 and he was a student at UCC. They'd been able to get the Musgrave tram in and out of college. 10 years later, he had a practice on the South Mall, and in 1913 he married Cissy, daughter of John Murrow of Mount Grange, Douglas. So you had Michael Cagney and Cissy Murrow marrying. And the celebrant was no less than His Grace Bishop Daniel Mannix. Don't know if you've heard of Daniel Mannix, Archbishop of Melbourne. Very influential in his time in Irish and Australian history, and several biographies have been written by him, about him. And he actually was related. His mother was Cagney. Daniel Mannix's mother was Cagney. The Murrows, Michael Cagney's wife, the Murrows were an old Cork City family of long lineage, and they were active in Cork's stock exchange on the South Mall. Now, keeping in with the Smiths paid off, and Michael Cagney acquired ownership of the hotel after Mary's death. He doesn't appear to have lived there, rather he remained in the city at Lansdowne Terrace, I think that's on the top of Patrick's Hill, and later at Sunday's Well. And he and Cissy had 10 children, and one of those 10 children married Noel Murphy, the cattle dealer, a well-known cattle dealer. And in 2012, around the time that Noel Murphy died at the age of 95, a biography of him appeared. And in that biography, he described his father-in-law, Michael Cagney, in great detail, several pages describing him. Now, the business was under Michael Cagney's ownership, but it retained the name Smith's Hotel, and it was perceived as a gold mine. But it doesn't seem to have brought much joy to Michael. He had it in difficult times, and he dabbled in property and shares, losing out financially, and he tended to drink excessively. That's Michael Cagney. It also had competition at this point in the form of Corcoran's Hotel. Now, Corcoran's were a family with a great deal of land. They ran the post office in the village and had some accommodation also. And in 1886, Eugene Corcoran applied for a licence for a public house. George Smith's solicitor opposed it at that time, stating that Eugene Corcoran was a very respectable man with a very respectable farm of 300 acres, and it would give him more than enough to do to attend to it. So they successfully blocked the licence for Corcoran's at that time. But around 1892, Corcoran's eventually secured their licence, and in 1894 the village had 2 hotels, and St Anne's Hydro wasn't too far away at all, and all 3 were outlets for a fête champêtre, or basically a garden party in aid of St Raphael's Asylum for the Blind in Montenotte. Now, Corcoran's traded to 1928 when it was auctioned, and in August 29 we get our first reference to the Musgrave Arms, which is the name that is still out there, when it was renamed by Nora Coffey. So Nora Coffey succeeded Corcoran's at the Musgrave Arms. She previously had a bar in Princess Street, and she ran the Musgrave Arms for several decades, dying in 1957, aged 89, at McCurtain Street. But the greatest trouble for Michael Cagney was the War of Independence. It was the severely disrupted state of the country at this time. And in fact, the hotel found itself at the very epicentre of these troubles on the 1st of June 1920, when you could fairly say it ceased to exist. And I mean it literally ceased to exist. At 10 p.m. on the 1st of June 1920, some men entered the bar and ordered the customers out and the staff to the back of the premises. They then placed the bomb in the fire grate with the intention of demolishing, or at least blowing a hole in the wall to effect an entrance and take over the police barracks next door. The bomb was either not well prepared or well positioned, and the result was that it kicked back and blew the front of the hotel to bits with a terrific explosion. Several of the policemen had been sitting outside the barracks, talking or reading the newspaper, and had remained unsuspicious that anything was going on. And ironically, extra defences of barbed wire placed around the barracks for the times that were in it made it difficult for them to get back in quickly after the explosion. And Constable Butcher was reported to have injured his hand on the barbed wire, or else it was hit with a bullet, or else both. There then followed a battle of bombs and guns for an hour and a half until the attackers ultimately retired. and Sergeant Larkin said that they had anticipated an attack any night, but not at such a comparatively early hour. They didn't think it would happen so early, thought more like maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. A remarkable feature of the explosion was that its iron porch was blown out into the street while the door went inwards. Now, another small piece of oral history I got was from a man called Healy, whose father made his living at this time with a horse and cart. And after the burning of Cork, he salvaged some iron pillars from a premises in the city and carted them out to Blarney. And they were used in the reconstruction of the hotel. And they're on the right hand side of that photograph, encased in wood with photographs hanging off them. But inside those there's round iron pillars that came out from the city after the burning of Cork. So it was from the man's own son that I got that. That wouldn't be recorded anywhere or written anywhere, but that's family history for you, is often these stories that come down. Now, as if Dr. Cagney didn't have enough trouble, there was another raid in 1921. I don't know whether it was political or not, but armed men entered the hotel. It was a very lawless time. They held up the people inside it and robbed the place. Now, Dr. Cagney, Michael Cagney, had a manager, and his name was Paddy Creedon. And he was manager in 1924 when the country had settled down a bit. Though his wife, Bridget, she was called Birdie, she had a little Pomeranian dog stolen from her that summer in 1924. Terrible times. One of her children was sick at the time, and she didn't notice the absence of the dog till around tea time. It had free range in the hotel. She said that the hotel was quiet and recollected that she last saw the dog at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Around that time, the driver of a Jarvie car and another man and a lady were in, and she suspected them of taking the dog. She told this to the guards, and subsequently William McSweeney of Corporation Buildings Cork and Jeremiah Sheehan of Mill Street were charged with the larceny of the Pomeranian dog. The dog was valued at 5 shillings 5 pence, and in the ensuing court case, the dog couldn't be produced as he was in Mill Street, and a further date was set. So, just a small little story, but it shows that after things had settled down and the hotel was rebuilt, as you can see from that photograph also. Now, Michael Cagney is listed in Guy's directories as having the hotel up to at least 1935, but the 1938 edition gives a Patrick Flynn as a manager, and Cagney is not listed. Another manager was Joan Linehan, and she was living at the hotel in 1937, and she was one of the prize winners in American Manny Woolen Mills knitting competition. There it is. And there was a strong expectation that she would marry the next owner, who was Michael Forrest, my grand-uncle. But that never did happen. In time, she went on to work in the Victoria Hotel, and she worked there up to the time it closed in 1976. So, just to finish up with Michael Cagney, it would look like that he possibly went bankrupt. I haven't found definitive evidence of that, but it looks like he did. His name has gone off the listings for it, and it was auctioned in 1940. He lived on to 1949 himself. He died at 69 of cardiac failure in the North Infirmary. So the auction for the premises took place on October 25th, 1940, and that's the date it came into the ownership of my own granduncle, Michael J. Forrest. And Marshes gave a description at the time: spacious bar, smoking room, private serving room, dining room, drawing room, 9 bedrooms, bathroom, lavatory, hot press, kitchen and domestic offices. It had electric light at the time, a large yard with stables, a garage, a storehouse and a garden. And then there was the adjacent dwelling house, which was vacant at that time, had good rent potential, a tiled hall, sitting room, 2 bedrooms, a bathroom with hot and cold water, a hot press, separate WC and a kitchen with built-in china cupboards. So that was kind of a residential side of it. And that's where I would have grown up as well, in that part of it. So look, we're kind of over the hour, so I'll just speed up with the slides. That's him himself. He was born in 1883, And when he was about 19, in about 1903, he left home. He left home suddenly. He grew up in a large family on a farm at the edge of the village. And the story is that he took his brother's money, without saying it, and he left a note on the pillow saying, "I'll pay you back," and he went off to America. And he spent 30 years plus in America, in New York, and he worked with a department store called Gimbel's. They were one of the main department stores in New York at that time. They were sort of a competitor to Macy's. They're gone out of business now. So he started off as a clerk, and he worked his way up, and he eventually became a buyer of materials. So that meant a bit of travelling, and I do recall seeing a photograph of him in a rickshaw in China, but if we don't take care of things, these things disappear, so I don't know where that photograph is now. But in time, he never married, but he had something of a playboy lifestyle, I'd say. He was back and forward across the Atlantic. I've seen pictures on the ships of the time, and you could say there's parties going on with kind of flapper girls of the 1920s, priests and nuns, the whole lot. You know, I suppose there's a big occasion going across the Atlantic on the ship. And he also traded horses across the Atlantic on occasion. But eventually he came back to Ireland to settle, and he called to the home place where he had a lot of brothers and sisters who were unmarried, and they weren't sure how to receive him because they didn't know whether he had made money or whether he was broke or what the story was. But my grandfather had married, and he called up to him, and my grandfather and grandmother made him welcome. I suppose they said, "Come in and sit down and have a cup of tea." And as it turned out, he had kept his money, he had made his money, and he bought the hotel in 1940, as you just saw. And horses were big in his life. He kept horses at the hotel while there were still stables. He had a couple of notable ones. Ding Dust was one horse that did well, but probably his best was a horse called Safety, who set a record or a stone wall jump at the RDS. And you can see there he's getting getting the cup from Lord Powerscourt. I don't think he was particularly small, but maybe Lord Powerscourt was particularly tall. And he reached the age of 70, and you could say he was 20 years running the hotel, and he went down to Blarney to attend the races there in 1954, and lo and behold, he suffered a heart attack down there, and that was the end of him. He died on the race course. He died soon after leaving the race course, and I suppose it was kind of a way that suited him. A few press little snippets tell us about the times as well. In 1942, it was the pub with no beer. So the Blarney Castle Hotel wishes to inform visitors to Blarney that stout will not be available this weekend, or stock is temporarily exhausted. And again, I suppose it was to do with the emergency, as World War II time was termed in Ireland. And then in 1945, not long after World War II had ended, there was an end to no petrol, and he advertised in the Examiner encouraging people to motor out to Blarney if they could at all. Here we have more notices that give us a flavour of Michael Forrest's time. So in 1945, the Blarney LSF held their final reunion at the Castle Hotel, and they were joined by the LDF, so that it was now the Castle Hotel, that was the name that he had on it. They were joined by the LDF group leader Sir George Colthurst was absent, and D. Downing, assistant group leader, presided.
What's SLA?
The LDF was the local defence force, which became the FCA. 1947, an exemption was granted to midnight for a supper for the Married Men's Association. Amidst laughter, Justice Keeley said it was the first time he heard of such an organisation. Blarney was always big for cycling as well, and in 1950 the Munster Cycling Convention was held at the hotel, in addition to several other years. And in more sporting terms, Michael sponsored a cup for a running race, a foot race, from the Cork Examiner office to the hotel. I think that went on for about 2 or 3 years. 1952, cup presentation by the Northern Coursing Club at the Castle Hotel. Members, please note, admission strictly by card obtainable from Miss Walsh in Blackpool. So to give you a flavour of the times, what was important to people, and the nature of business being done. And there's a note then on his debt, so he had arrived in Killarney last night for the races, and his horse Dingdust was entered for the 140 race today. And it gets his age wrong. It says he was aged about 50, but he would in fact have been 70. So now, I told you that my grandparents, supposedly, so the story goes, made him feel welcome, and sure enough, he willed the hotel to them. So they came into his older brother, my grandfather, who would have been, he would have been about 4 years older than him, so he would have been about 74 when he inherited the hotel from his brother, and my grandmother was a bit younger. But their children were young, growing up, and they had a big family too. And my father and my uncle are pictured there in white coats, nothing to do with hospital or anything. But, so they helped out, they helped their uncle, and then of course they helped their parents after the uncle's death. And my father spent 50 years at the hotel, and my uncle, he went and made his own living in Waterford. So that was Michael's brother there with the glasses, the roundy glasses, my grandfather, and there he is presenting a cup to the Bachelor of Blarney in 1962, just outside the hotel. I don't think he ever worked much at the hotel because he wasn't a young man at all. That's my grandparents' wedding day on the left. So that's the same man there as the roundy glasses on the left there. That was their wedding day long before they inherited the hotel. And then my parents, who married in 1964 and ran the hotel for several decades and upgraded it, worked with Board Foyle, Cork Kerry Tourism, and tried to introduce all the improvements on suite rooms and that as well.
What's your mum's name again?
Claire. And then their eldest son, my brother, he went to Cahill Brewer Street where he had hotel management. He did his hotel management there. He worked in Switzerland for a short time. He spent a bit of time in America. He worked in Killarney, and he really has kind of lifted the hotel further again, and works terribly hard. But that's the hotel guest register at the time of his birth. He was born in the mid-60s, and you can see guests staying at the hotel. There was probably 9 or 10 bedrooms at that time, with addresses Toronto, Dublin, Birmingham, Connecticut, Boston, Leeds, Hastings, London, Hobart, Cheshire, Cambridge. So Ireland, England, America, Australia. And finally, well, of course, the website and all that is all. Every business has that now, and social media. And just to finish up, then we had our notice from 1777 about the set ring that was lost. And to bring us full circle, we have a similar notice from 1952, found a bracelet at Blarney Castle Hotel. Owner can have the same by giving particulars, apply at the hotel. And they didn't have to refurbish the cost of the advert. So we hear that the 1950s were hard times, but they must have improved a lot from the 1770s. So I know I've gone over the hour a bit, but look, that's given you a brief trip through several centuries of a family business. Several families, of course.
Thank you very much, Richard. Do you know the bridge there? You said that the
dry bridge.
Where was that? Going into Blarney or coming out the Waterloo?
It is very near the square.
On the back road,
there's a nice little lodge house.
Yeah,
lodge house. I mean, I suppose you're only talking about maybe a couple 100 metres from the corner of the square, really. And the dry bridge would have been just after that lodge house, if anybody knows it. There's a slight bump in the road, a slight small bump in what's otherwise a flat road. That's where the bridge was supposed to be.
Thanks very much. Richard was up in the library, and he had another talk a few weeks ago there about Cork characters, and he had did as well in one of the libraries where you had, what else last year, you had another.
We had one on Blarney Street, another one.
On the street, a regular up in Mayfield Library. He's always active up there. So
we have Brendan Goggin up there. Brendan Goggin worked in the CIT, he was the registrar, I think, and he's very good for local history, and he did Dillon's Cross, Montanati, all that. He does some very good talks, actually.
There are always talks up there, so if anybody, I advertise them a few times, I sent them over, I think, if anybody wants to go. Thanks very much, we appreciate that for coming on tonight, and thanks everybody for coming. We got apologies from some people, you know, Anne Marie is living in County Waterford president of the society, so she doesn't come down as often as she used to in the winter in particular.